Amen. Mark chapter 12, this is the final week of the life of Christ. He has been going through a series of discussions, debates, discourses, you could say, with various people there in Jerusalem. And then verses 38 through 40, Jesus gives a warning about religious people and the people who like to be seen and like the attention drawn to themselves. They like to have prestigious clothing on. They like to be welcomed in certain social situations. They like to be exalted. And we see this, of course, very prominent in the denominational clergy system, both Catholic and Protestant people with exalting titles. Chapter 24 of Matthew is a more extensive teaching on this very thing, where Jesus says, don't be called rabbi, don't be called father, don't use religious titles. And so that's more extensively given in Matthew chapter 24. Here he says, you beware of the scribes, verse 38, who desire to go around in long robes, loves greetings in the marketplaces, and the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at feast, who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation. Now, the scribes that were viewed as the religious elite, those who were viewed as the epitome of the religious people there in Jerusalem, it's going to be contrast with this poor widow woman who's going to give 2 mites. They're verses 41 through 44. Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which makes a quadrans. So he called his disciples to himself and said to them, assuredly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. So she's putting in, this poor widow woman is putting in 2 very small copper coins, which would be equivalent to a fraction of a penny in our currency. And Jesus says that she puts in more than these rich who put in a lot. Now, notice what is said there in verse 41. Jesus was watching, and what you would have these boxes, and they would have almost like a trumpet-like opening to receive the coins. And people would put the coins in. And Jesus was watching, notice, how the people put money in. Not how much. How. The manner in which they were giving. So Jesus watches our giving too. The how of our giving. And he says those who were rich put in much. And this one widow put in these 2 mites. And he called his disciples, verse 43, and says, surely I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. Now how is that possible? Verse 44. For they put in out of their abundance. They're not giving sacrificially. They are giving out of their abundance. But she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. She was giving sacrificially, and because she was giving sacrificially, very much on a fixed income, she was giving, she gave more than those who were rich that were putting into the treasury because of how she gave, not how much. How she gave. And you know, sometimes you can come across some of the poorest people, and they are the most generous with their money, with their giving. They are the most generous people you can find. And in fact, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, 2 Corinthians chapter 8 talks about, chapters 8 and 9 of 2 Corinthians talk about the manner in which we are to give in the church. Of course, this was during when Jesus was observing the giving in the treasury in the temple. That was under the Mosaic system. But the attitude of giving is being talked about in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, and the attitude that we are to have in their giving. And some churches of Macedonia were set forth as examples. Chapter 8 and verse 1 of 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed upon the churches of Macedonia. Now notice verse 2. That in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. Now notice he's setting forth the Macedonian brethren there in verse 1, not because they're rich and they gave a bunch, but because they were poor and in a situation of a great trial of affliction, they gave abundantly out of their deep poverty. They gave. They were rich in their liberality. That means they were liberal in their giving out of their deep poverty. Now, how is that possible? Let's keep reading. For I bear them record that according to their ability, yes, beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. Verse 5. And not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord, then to us by the will of God. That's how, verse 5. They gave themselves first to the Lord. That means the Christians in Macedonia, these churches there in the area of Macedonia, were dedicated. God was first. You could put out beside verse 5 there, Matthew 6 and verse 33. Seek first the kingdom of heaven and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you, talking about the necessities of life. So they gave abundantly, they gave richly, they gave liberally, even though they were in deep poverty. Why? How could they do that? Because they first gave themselves to the Lord. That was an attitude there of great gratitude toward God, and they gave to the Lord richly. And therefore, Paul is setting them forth as examples of generous givers. He never does talk about how much they gave, but he did talk about how liberal they were in their giving. You know, sometimes when you get a report from some big work that brethren are involved in, they'll highlight the big givers. Brother so-and-so gave $500,000 to this cause and such and such and such. And they highlight the big givers, where in the Bible, these poor brethren are the ones who are highlighted. Not the rich brethren with the deep pockets, but the poor, the ones who were in deep poverty. They abounded in the riches of their liberality. But the reason why they could do that is because they first gave themselves to the Lord. They were living sacrifices. Romans 12, verse 1 and 2. So, the concept of giving is a concept, you find really delineated there in chapters 8 and 9 of 2 Corinthians. It is not the amount so much as it is the how you give. Now, of course, we need to give liberally. We need to give abundantly. We need to give in a sacrificial way. However, the how has to be there. And later on, Paul talks about being a cheerful giver. Not grudgingly, out of necessity, but being a cheerful giver. And a cheerful giver is one who gives themselves to the Lord. They're dedicated to the Lord and the Lord's cause. That means so much to them. So many congregations have been saved from financial ruin, have been saved by little widow ladies who would put in the will the church, the congregation. Because they know they can't take it with them. When they pass away, the big lump sum, or sometimes just a few thousand, will go to the congregation and help the congregation out. And some of the most liberal givers, as far as helping out, will be those who are small congregations. I remember times when I was trying to raise money to go to Africa on a campaign or go to Jamaica. You would get money from the unexpected places. There will be places where you thought there's no way they could give anything, and they give. And then you go to some of the bigger places that you thought surely they'll give something, and they won't even give a dime. And so you never know. You just never know. Any comment or question or discussion about this when it comes to giving? Right. They know how to survive. They know that God will take care of them. Now, there are exceptions to that. You'll come across some wealthy people who are very generous in their giving. And you'll come across some poor brethren that are very stingy and will not give. You know, it puzzles me that you'll come across sometimes elderly folks, or sometimes you'll come across some low income, as we would call them, and we're all getting to that point, the low income, with things going on. But they say, I can't give anything Sunday because I'm on a fixed income. Well, this woman was definitely on a fixed income, and she found something to give. And these same people that will say that, they'll go out to eat on Sunday, some restaurant, or they'll go spend money on themselves. Why not say, we're going to eat at home, and what we would spend at a restaurant, we're going to give to the Lord, so we'll have something to give to the Lord. Sacrifices, sacrificial giving. And that's what it says in Malachi. Will a man rob God? How have you robbed me? By tithes and offerings. You're withholding. You're holding back. And the Bible says, God says in Malachi, put me to the test. And that means, okay, I'm going to give sacrificially to the cause of Christ, and will He take care of His people? Yes, He will. He will. And so the concept of giving is something that is an interesting topic that you find in the New Testament. But you first have to have in place a dedicated heart, a devoted disciple. When that's there, the giving is going to just come naturally. That's just going to be what they'll do. Chapter 13. Now, we may get through chapter 13 tonight, we may not. There's a lot of interesting things here concerning the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of time. Chapter 13 and verse 1. Then as he went out of the temple. One of his disciples said to him, Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here? Jesus answered and said to him, Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. That was a shocking statement to make to the Jews, to this Jewish individual. They're saying, look at this building, and according to history, Herod had refurbished the temple. It was a very beautiful sight to behold. The building complex was just awesome. The courts around it were very much decorated, and it was just a sight to behold. And because Jerusalem was on a mountainous type area, Mount Zion, as you have it referred to in the Bible, you could see it for miles, and if the sun hit it just right, it would just glisten in the sunlight, just like you see a city where a skyscraper or a building that has some shiny metal on it or windows on it would glisten in the sun when the sun hits it just right. They said the same thing about the temple. It was just a magnificent building. And Jesus says, it's going to be destroyed. It's going to be destroyed. And so in their mind, that's like, no, that's not the plan. That's not the what's supposed to happen. Because again, they misunderstood the concept of the kingdom, that it was going to be a military empire, Jerusalem was going to be the capital, and the temple was going to be the centerpiece. Verse 3, Now as they sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew asked him privately, Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled? When you read Matthew's account, in Matthew chapter 24, they're also asking, when will come the end? When will the end be? And they're asking this question because in their minds, and this is going to explain why Jesus answers the way he does, in their minds, the end of the temple is the end of the world. There's no more world after the temple. There's no more age of the earth after that. They could not conceive of God's religion without a physical temple being a part of it. So in their thinking, they're asking one question, but Jesus is answering it in two parts. He's answering when will be the destruction of Jerusalem, and then when will be the end of time. In their minds, that's one question, because they don't fully understand things. And so this kind of helps us understand the language here, because if you're not careful, it can be a little bit confusing. But as you see up here on the board, beginning in verse 5 through 30, Jesus is going to be talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And the reason why I know that is because of the language that's found that we're going to go into as we go into this a little bit deeper. But also, verse 30. Look at verse 30 of Mark chapter 13. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away, till all these things take place. So everything that he had been speaking about from verses 5 through 29 is going to take place within the generation he's talking to. So it's talking about what we read about in history as the destruction of Jerusalem, because it's happening within the time frame of the people that he is speaking to. Now, verses 31 through 37, Jesus is going to answer the other question that they had, that they thought was one question, but actually was two. Look at verse 31 of Mark chapter 13. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Verse 32, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. What's he saying when he says, but of that day? He's talking about the day that the heaven and the earth pass away. That's what he's referring back to in verse 31. So in verses 31 through 37 of Mark chapter 13, he's talking about the end of time, when the heaven and the earth will pass away. But before that, he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now here's the mistake that people make, and of course they make it more with Matthew chapter 24 because it's more of an extended version of what we have. What we have here in Mark 13 is more condensed. They say that everything that Jesus is answering here is talking about basically the end of time. And so when they look at all these signs and these things happening all around, earthquakes and the various things that go along here in Mark chapter 13, they say that means these are signs to the end of time. And they're not making a distinction within the text as to what really is going on here. And so they come up with these concepts. Oh, we're living in the last days. Why? Because in Cleburne, Texas, there was an earthquake. We're living in the last days because, our economic situation in the U.S. is just really bad. We're living in the last days because, you just think about all the famines that we have and disease that we have today. So they sensationalize all of these things. They go to the news headlines and they take those news headlines and they say, oh, it's right here in the Bible. So we must be in the last days. Jesus must be coming soon. And that's how premillennialism operates. But what we're going to look at here, is just a simple understanding of how Jesus is answering will help us understand that Jesus is giving two answers to one question, and that one question is in their mind, but it's actually two answers. And oftentimes, you find that in the Old Testament. When we study the Old Testament prophets, what would they do when they would talk about the people going into Babylonian captivity or going into captivity for 70 years? They would say, the people are going to return to the land, they're going to rebuild the temple, and then the Messiah is going to come. Well, that didn't happen all at once. The people did come back, rebuild the land, but some 400 years later, the Messiah came. But they would speak of it as an event. And no time frame or reference is given. And this is exactly how Jesus is answering here. It's an event. Jesus is going to come in judgment on Jerusalem and destroy it. But he's going to come in judgment on the world when the heavens and the earth pass away. Now, when Israel rejected Jesus and they killed him on the cross, they gave themselves a fatal wound that would not kill them for another 40 years. When they rejected Christ, they gave themselves a fatal wound, but that wound would not come as far as a culminating effect until the year 70 AD when the Romans would destroy Jerusalem. So you see here how that God, in His forbearance and grace, was giving those in Israel who would believe in Jesus and obey Him a chance to be saved, because the nation is going to die. The nation is a lost cause. The nation is going to be destroyed because they killed the Son of God. It's kind of like using another illustration, that when a ship like the Titanic hit the iceberg, it did not sink immediately. There was still time for people to get off the ship before it totally went under. But it was going to go under. There was nothing stopping it. Same thing with Israel. When they killed Christ, they gave themselves a fatal blow. And Jesus is talking about what's going to happen within a generation. Now, let's read and see what Jesus says. Verse 5, Jesus answering them began to say, "Take heed that no one deceives you." Very good beginning point, because so many people have been deceived on the end of time and things concerning the end times. Verse 6, "For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and will deceive many. But when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be troubled, for such things must happen, but the end is not yet." Many are going to come saying that I am he. They're claiming to be the Messiah. You find that in the book of Acts. They talk about people who claim to be the Messiah, and they were not. False messiahs that would have a following in the first century. You're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. That happened a lot in the Roman Empire. He says, but the end is not yet. Verse 8, "For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines and troubles. These are the beginning of sorrows." Now, they had earthquakes in various places in the first century leading up to 70 AD. We read about an earthquake in Acts chapter 16 that freed Paul and Silas who were in prison. So various earthquakes were going on in the first century. One of them happened in 62 AD, and several others happened as well. So there were various earthquakes that were recorded. They're just the beginning of sorrows. Verse 9, "But watch out for yourself, for they will deliver you up to councils, and you will be beaten in the synagogues. You will be brought before rulers and kings for my name's sake, for a testimony to them. The gospel must first be preached to all nations." Now, look at verse 9. Who is he talking to? He's talking to the apostles, or at least 4 of them. Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And notice what he says. This is what's going to happen to you. So he's talking about things that's going to happen in their lifetime. You watch out for yourself. They're going to deliver you up to councils. They will beat you in the synagogue. You read about the persecution of the apostles in the book of Acts. You're brought before rulers and kings for my name's sake. Paul was brought before Agrippa, before Felix. He appealed to Caesar. And this will be for my sake, for a testimony to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations. People say, verse 10 must be referring to our modern day because they did not have the means to preach the gospel to everyone. That's simply not the case. Look at Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 23. Was the gospel preached to all nations in the first century? According to the New Testament writings, it was. Verse 23. If indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. So that happened within that generation, the gospel. So how can that happen? How can you have 6-7 billion people being preached to? You didn't have 6 or 7 billion back then. It is estimated that the population of the earth, of course, is just an estimation based upon variables, that the population of the earth during the time of the first century was probably around 500 million. That's just a little bit bigger than the United States is right now. That's the population of the whole earth. So was it possible for the gospel to spread to all nations within the first century? Sure. Very real possibility. They had means of travel all over the world. In fact, a lot of modern historians are coming to terms with some things that they would deny years ago. But the fact is, there is evidence that ancient people traveled all over the place, including the Americas. North American area, Central America, South America. They're finding artifacts of people like Egyptians in like South America. Whether it be pottery or jewelry or artwork. Well, how did that get there? That shouldn't be there. Well, they had to travel there. So there was worldwide travel 2,000 years ago. It's not out of the realm of possibility. So there's just, I think there was a documentary, I'm trying to think of the name of the documentary, it was called Before Columbus. And it documented all of this evidence about people who traveled to the United States before there was a United States, before Columbus did. Europeans, Polynesians, Chinese, and it was very much something that was scoffed at years ago, but the evidence is just out there and people are coming to terms with it. The point is, verse 10, yes, the gospel, according to the Scriptures, was preached to all nations. And look at how they did it. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have the modern travel. And yet they spread the gospel. Acts chapter 8 and verse 1 talks about the church being scattered abroad. And those that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word. Spreading the gospel. So verse 11, look at Mark chapter 13 verse 11. But when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak, but whatever is given you in that hour, speak that. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. This was, again, to the apostles. When they would go before these rulers and such, the Holy Spirit would inspire them to speak. They didn't have to prepare a sermon. The Holy Spirit would speak through them. Again, that's giving you a time frame that this is referring to that generation. Verse 12, now brother will betray brother to death, and father his children. Children will rise up against parents, cause them to be put to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. So he's talking about troublesome times, the difficult times that are coming. And he says you're going to have people in your family that are going to betray you to death. And so will father the children, and children rise up against parents. And so there's going to be that betrayal even within the family. And you're going to be hated by all. This is not going to be a popular thing that you're doing. But he who endures to the end will be saved. So you've got to endure to the end. We got to be faithful unto death. Revelation 2 and verse 10. There's a passage you can put right there next to that. Be faithful unto death, and you'll receive a crown of life. So they were people who were persecuted, and of course history bears that out. Now verse 14 says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where he ought not, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This goes back to our Daniel study. Daniel chapter 11 verse 31. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 11. The abomination of desolation. There's going to be someone that's going to be an abominable individual. And he is going to be standing where he ought not. He's going to be in a place he should not be. Well, history bears out that what they did with Rome, or what they did with Jerusalem, the Roman soldiers, they would besiege it. And they would cut off all the supplies. Try to starve Jerusalem into submission. And then they would break through. Once they could, they would break through the barriers, the walls, go in, and they would go into the temple there, and they would start burning it down. They would start burning it and trying to get as much gold as possible. So that was that abomination of desolation that Daniel even foretold. Remember, Daniel in that book spoke about the destruction of Jerusalem and what Jesus is talking about right now. Now, look at verse 14 at the end. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Again, he's giving you a time frame. When you see all this happening, you get out of Jerusalem. You flee to the mountains. And history records that not one Christian perished when Jerusalem was destroyed. All the Christians, when they started seeing what was going on around them, because of what Jesus said and what they had read in the Scriptures, they got out of Jerusalem. They knew that, hey, something's about to go down. Something's about to happen. And so they got out. Verse 15, let him who is on the housetop not go down into the house, nor enter and take anything out of his house. You get out. You don't have time to pack your bags. You get out as soon as possible. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. You don't have time. Get out. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter. Now, why would he say, woe to those who are pregnant and nursing babies in those days? Tough. Tough to travel. You know, they don't have minivans and car seats and a 24-hour Walmart down the road to get something if they forgot it. It's going to be rough. Travel was going to be very difficult, especially if you had to leave on the spur of the moment. And pray that your flight be not in winter. Why? Cold. Cold. And yeah, further up in the mountainous area you go, it gets colder. So that's going to be rough when that happens. Matthew adds something here that you don't find in Mark 13. He says, and pray that it's not on the Sabbath that this happens. Why? Right. The gates of the city were closed in Jerusalem. It'd be hard to get out of Jerusalem if the gates were shut up. So there's several factors he's saying there that could be a problem. Verse 19, for in those days there will be tribulation such as has not been since the beginning of the creation which God created until this time, nor ever shall be. And unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those are the whom He chose, He shortened the days. So here he's saying, look, it's going to get, what he's saying there in verse 19, it's going to get really bad in Jerusalem as a result of what's happening. And history records, Josephus, read the account of Josephus, the Jewish historian. He witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, and he wrote about it in his writings. And he talked about how things got really bad in Jerusalem and how that there were people who were actually, because they were starving to death, killing their children and eating their children. And they said when the Romans finally went in and started just massacring all the Jews, that the blood actually ran in the streets. And certain fires were even put out as a result of the flow of blood. Human blood, because people were just being slaughtered. I think there were 1 million plus Jews killed in that situation. Many of them were crucified. And that's how they killed Jesus. God is not mocked. God is not mocked. And they brought that on themselves when they killed the Son of God. Verse 21, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, he is there, do not believe it. He says, for false Christs and false prophets will rise and show signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. But take heed, see, I have told you all these things beforehand. I'm telling you, there's going to be tricksters out there. There are going to be people out there who want a following and say, look, I'm the Christ. Well, even in modern day settings, you have things like that today. Years ago, I think it was, 92? What was that, 20 years ago? You had David Koresh down in Waco claiming to be the Son of God. His compound was burned down and he was killed in it, in that situation. I mean, you have people claiming to be the Christ and false prophets, showing signs and wonders to deceive. So when people claim signs and wonders and miracles, it's for the purpose of deceiving. If possible, even the elect. The elect there is referring to God's chosen people. They're going to be so convincing, some of these tricks, that they'll even deceive you if you're not careful. They know how to manipulate people. But he's saying in verse 23, take heed and see, I have told you all these things beforehand. I'm warning you this is going to happen. So watch out for it. Now, beginning in verse 24 through 27, it sounds like the end of time. But I want you to notice a phrase that keeps reoccurring all throughout this. He talks about those days, plural, verse 24. He talks about, verse 19, in those days. Verse 20, those days. So it's talking about that time frame of that generation that he's going to speak of. Those days, this is a period of time this is taking place. Those days, you find that phrase. But when he starts talking about the end of time, he says, of that day, singular. He switches his phraseology, which indicates he's talking about something different. Of that day, no one knows when it'll happen. But in those days, I just have a little bit of time to get this in. In those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars of heaven will fall, the powers of heavens will be shaken. Then you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels to gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest part of heaven. Some will say, well, that's got to be talking about the end of the world. But remember what was said in verse 30, all these things will happen in this generation. This generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. So verses 24 through 27, he's using the language of the prophets to denote judgment. Not his literal coming right there, but his judgment at the end of time. And the reason why I know that, and we just have time for this one quick reference, Isaiah chapter 19. Isaiah chapter 19 and verse 1. God making a proclamation against Egypt. God's going to bring down Egypt. Now notice what it says. The burden against Egypt, Isaiah 19 and verse 1, behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and will come into Egypt. The idols of Egypt will totter at his presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst. God is coming into Egypt riding on a cloud. Well, literally, no. He's using language to denote judgment upon Egypt. And so that's exactly what you find here in verses 24 through 27, that Jesus is talking about judgment. He's using prophetic language that we've seen in the prophets to denote judgment upon Jerusalem. He's still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, will he come with the clouds and flaming fire with his holy angels at the end of time? Yes. But these passages are not talking about that. Other passages talk about that. What he's saying here, he's coming in judgment upon them, and he's giving them signs to indicate, you need to be aware that this is happening. You better get out before this actually happens. And he did providentially bring judgment upon Jerusalem using the Roman Empire. And again, that's how God would operate. He would use one empire to conquer another. He did that with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, and the Romans. And so, he's using language here to denote judgment upon Jerusalem. Keep reading and studying this chapter, and in 2 weeks, Lord willing, we will come back to it and we'll finish up Mark chapter 13.